Thank you very much, Lisa. And again, welcome to everyone. My name is Rochelle Campbell. I lead NACD's board recruitment practice, as she'd mentioned, where we work with member companies looking to place directors. I've worked with a number of boards over the years on diversity and inclusion issues. And in the last 6 years, 85% of our board placements have been diversity candidates. So we're really proud of that number. And as you may understand, I'm very interested in today's topic and understanding more from our partners around the compensation side of it. So to make our conversation more interactive, please turn, as Lisa already mentioned, your cameras on and go ahead and type any of your questions in the chat boxes so we can involve you in the conversation. I'd like to thank our sponsors again, Pearl Meyer, and now I'll turn it over to Mike Esser, Managing Director in the Los Angeles and Santa Fe office. Mike?
Thanks, Rochelle, and thank you all, Northern California members, for your time today, as well as allowing us to host what should be a very interesting discussion. I think as Rochelle mentioned, I'm a managing director with Pearl Meyer, and until this past year, I've been splitting my time between our LA and San Jose offices. But now, for the most part, despite the background, I've been working from home for a year, so probably in the same boat as many of you. We have been working as well with clients for several years on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, and whether and how to incorporate DE&I into compensation programs. But the events of 2020 really accelerated that discussion, and DEI is, now we found it to be really top of mind with all of the boards, or many of the boards and compensation committees that we work with. I think originally the title for this session was supposed to be the business case for including DEI, but in our pregame discussions as a panel, we thought it better be called, is your board really ready to handle the challenges of including DEI in your compensation programs? So we've assembled a great panel. We've got Eileen, Susan, and Jan to facilitate the discussion. We hope it's very interactive with the member group. I'll ask them to introduce themselves, and I'll step out of the way, and maybe we can start with Eileen.
Greetings, wherever you are in the afternoon or evening in your time zones. And I looked through the attendee list. I think so many of you could be sitting here sharing your views of what's happening on your board. So we're hoping throughout the session, we're going to get you engaged and hear what you're doing with your boards and tying incentives or not to the DEI/ESG initiatives. There's a lot of work going on in both of those domains right now. I currently sit on two public boards, one down in Southern California, which is a data analytics platform called Alteryx. They went public in 2017, and I just joined them right after they went public. And another board I recently joined last August was private at the time. They're located in Chicago, CCC Information Services, that does analytics and workflow management for anybody who gets in a car accident, which unfortunately people do every day, but we want to streamline and make it easy for them to settle a claim. And that company just went public under a SPAC process on February 3rd. And we will be looking at de-SPACing sometime this year. For those of you that know what's going on in the SPAC process, it's a new one for me and I'm enjoying it. So let me turn it over to my co-partner here, Susan.
Thank you, Eileen. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a special pleasure for me because I'm a recent transplant to California from Boston. I was very involved in NACD there. I serve on the boards of two public companies. I am the comp chair for one of them, and I'm also on the board of two very large nonprofits and have served as the comp chair for one of those. So really looking forward to the conversation today. I'll just say on a very personal note for me, not just a woman, but an African-American woman, the importance of DE&I is front and center. So thank you, Lisa, for inviting me to be on the panel, and I'm really looking forward to a conversation with you today.
I guess that leads me to
yes,
to bring up the rear. I am a managing director with Perlmeyer as well, a colleague of Mike's. I am in the Chicago office, and I see many familiar friends and familiar faces on my screen here. So it's lovely to see everyone. I'm looking forward to the conversation. And again, just as a reminder, as Rochelle mentioned, this is a virtual roundtable, not a webcast. This is not talking heads to nodding heads. This is meant to be a conversation. The panel, Susan and Mike and Eileen and myself will kind of kick it off, but we really would like all of you to be involved. I've got a couple of slides to show just to level set where the marketplace is on this DE&I issue with regard to incentives. And then we'll have a discussion around what's really going on in the marketplace and some of the things that you have to consider if your board is looking at whether and how to introduce DE&I into your incentive programs. But maybe a question to Eileen and Susan, if you go back 10 years ago, 20 years ago, heck, even 5 years ago, nobody was talking about DE&I at the board level. Not that those discussions weren't going on, but I think DE&I and other sort of corporate culture related topics were considered by the board to belong firmly in the purview of management, not the board. And I'm wondering, what's different now? Why is it that the board has suddenly decided to stick their noses into this?
Eileen, would you like to start, or would you like me?
Go ahead, you start. We'll tag.
Okay. I think that there are a couple of reasons. The first is I really do think that the business case for a diverse staff and an inclusive organization is becoming more and more apparent. There's now data that really shows the economic value of this. I have spent my career in the innovation spaces, i.e. in life sciences companies, in healthcare services companies, and innovation really is a team sport. And so there's a growing recognition that differences in problem-solving skills, differences in perspectives is an important part of that innovation team. I think also there's a recognition now that for many of our shareholders, but also for many of our customers, this is important. And I'll just say very quickly, one of the boards on which I have sat and have been the comp chair is a very large health plan, over 2 million members. And so the decision about business is driven by just a few decision makers. And as those decision makers have come to care more and more about diversity and inclusion of the board and of the leadership team and of just the customer facing members of that health plan, it's really become a priority. So I think from the perspective of products and services, customers, and the ability to compete for talent, we are realizing that this is very important, and it has elevated to the board level because there now needs to be real accountability in the organization for activities that pertain to DE&I.
Yeah, well said. I'll add to that. I have a little bit of echo there. That it's a business reality of investors are asking the questions, right? There are many investors today. If you are a privately held company and you're looking for funding, there are some investors that won't even take a second call with you unless you have a strong DEI portfolio or at least a plan. I'll mention ESG in the sense that ESG has become so important. It's really the S and the G inside ESG that calls out DEI. So you look at like the World Economic Forum that has pulled together the International Business Council, that has worked with the top accounting firms that are now putting in place key non-financial metrics that for sure public companies are expected to be reporting on. And in those metrics under the S and the G are the diversity of your board, the diversity of your population, the G and the governance, absolutely how your board is managing the ESG initiatives. So it's great to hope and think that most board members are doing this because it is indeed a good business case. But the reality is, why didn't they do it 5 years ago or 10 years ago? It's always been a good business case. Now the reality is getting external pressures from financial markets and investors. And most importantly, the whole social justice with the millennials and the younger the younger members of companies that are really saying, I don't even want to join a company unless they have a good DEI strategy. So you're getting pressures from both sides, and boards are very much in tune to that today. I'll pause there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. You know, I think that maybe what I will do to kind of kick off the issue of whether or not, you know, how you think about it from an incentive point of view is I will briefly share what we've seen from some data on what's in the marketplace right now. And then we can go to the issue of whether or not, you know, how that kind of jives with the experience of our panelists and everybody else on the phone. So let me share my screen. Everybody see that? Yeah? Okay. So we polled looked at the Russell 3000 for last year's proxies, not this year's proxies, because of course those are just now starting to trickle out. But if you looked at last year's proxies, you would have seen that out of the Russell 3000, there were 79 companies that mentioned that they used some sort of diversity and inclusion metric in their incentive plan. So what that's, you know, that's 2.5% roughly. So a very, very small percentage. And as you looked at it, the majority of the companies, of those 79 companies, the majority of them were the larger companies. So not the Russell 3000, but the S&P 500. If you look at the way those companies include that data, the DE&I in their incentive plans, what you would find is almost to a person, to a company, it's included in the annual incentive metric. So while in theory, you know, we are all on a DE&I journey, and it is very much a long-term fix. This isn't something you can just flip a light switch on and fix it. Notwithstanding the fact that it's a long-term issue, from an incentive and compensation point of view, people have chosen to put it in the short-term incentive plan. There's a bit of a disconnect there, but we can talk about whether or not that's the right place and whether or not that makes sense. When you look at how companies include it in the incentive plan, what we see is that there is a majority of companies who simply mention it as part of kind of an overall strategic or qualitative metric. It's not a standalone measure. It's kind of incorporated into a broader measure that's called, you know, that's called business case or strategic metrics. There's a very few number of those 79 companies that actually use it as a standalone metric. So clearly, if you think about incorporating DE&I into an incentive plan, we are at the very, very early stages of this process for most companies, if you are a company that has this in your incentive plan as its own weighted standalone metric, you are an early mover.
Jan,
Because
this is
yeah,
Lisa. I'm just
yeah.
going to jump in and mention that nobody needs to worry about writing this down because we're going to distribute these slides after the program.
Thank you. I should have mentioned that. So, you know, if you've got this in your plan already, you're an early mover. Most companies don't yet. I would predict that, you know, if you think about this, these are 2020 incentive proxy statement disclosures. So they're reporting on 2019 plans before the pandemic, before George Floyd, before a whole lot of before Black Lives Matters, before a whole lot of things that have changed the social dynamic. I would expect that when we do this same analysis at the end of the current proxy season, and we're looking at the 2021 proxies that are reporting not only what companies did for 2020, but what they're planning on for 2021, we're going to see these numbers move up. And maybe substantially, although even with a substantial movement, it's still likely to not yet be prevalent practice. So with that, because this is not supposed to be a slideshow, I'm gonna get rid of the slides and go back to the conversation. So with that, I thought it would be interesting, you know, by show of hands, you know, how many people in the group, you know, currently have a DE&I metric in their incentive plans? Not a lot. I see a couple little fingers go up, but not a lot. So question to Susan and Eileen, do either of you have companies where you've already formally put DE&I in your incentives?
No, and I think the big question is, first of all, where is your company? Assess your company today. Is it important that you actually have to put a financial incentive in order for the leadership team to pay attention? It's sad, but I hope not. I hope actually your companies are doing much better in representation and inclusion and engagement without having to put an incentive in place. I want to give you two examples of my companies. The company Advent International that I consult with has 24 companies across North America. And they decided as a private equity investor, they wanted every single company in their portfolio to go through an outside third-party assessment. We brought in a third-party assessment tool for every single company to help us figure out what their baseline capabilities are or their journey is with DEI. We now rolled up all of those results at the end of December, and we put together kind of a heat map to show the companies that had the least maturity, it's been a nice word, in the diversity journey versus those that were well on their way to diversity. And one of the things that we required, not to put it in a compensation plan, but every single quarter, there had to be a board member who owned DEI who had to report on their activities for that quarter. And that meant representation, any senior leaders that they were recruiting for from VP on up, they had to go through the candidate pool, how diverse the candidate pool and what actions were being taken. And then if anything in particular for that quarter was going on, if it was, you know, the women's month, right? And what activities were going on, they had to report on those. So I guess my question to, you know, my fellow board members is, which is more important, to have a incentive in one of your metrics? And if so, if it's only a small percentage, 5 or 10% of an overall annual bonus plan, versus, you know, going into your board meeting every single quarter that you have to report on the diversity of your company, your leadership team, and the activities that are going on, which is more impactful? And I'll pass it to my colleague Susan and what her experiences have been.
Thanks, Eileen. So Jannice, your slides I thought were great in sort of teeing up this part of the conversation. And if you had asked, I would have raised my hand, but I would have raised half of my hand. So I'll tell you very quickly why I would have done that. Because the board did, the compensation committee did put in place a part of, as you said, the STIP. So it was an annual incentive. It was discretionary and it was qualitatively determined. And I'll tell you what we were looking at. But there really was no standalone metric in terms of there being a specific goal or a target. And it really emphasized, which I will share with all of you, the challenge between a commitment and accountability. And I think that we are at a point now where we really do have to think about and put in place accountability. So very quickly, we had a series of qualitative indicators. We wanted to know, from the leadership team, the senior leadership team, the pipeline of women and staff of color that had been identified and were being actively developed for more senior positions. We wanted the company to keep track of their external interface, with women's organizations, people of color. In other words, what were they doing to reach out and make it clear that we were a company that really valued DE&I? We wanted the leadership team to put in place a series of internal forums and activities that targeted women and staff of color. And we also wanted them to put in place very clear criteria for recruiters who were doing external searches for us to make sure that those searches were inclusive. Mm-hmm. The STIP, or the annual percentage of bonus potential, was 5%. It's 5% of the senior leadership team's bonus targets. And we found that a couple of things. One, that wasn't enough. We can talk about that later. But also the fact that we were really focused on, if you listen to what I said as our guidelines, they're all very process oriented. So the team could come back and they could talk about a lot of process, and they always hit the target, if you will, in terms of lots of activities, develop pipeline, developing, et cetera. But we never saw a lot of change. And the number of women and the number of people of color who were in senior leadership positions of my time, because I just turned off this board. I was on this board for 16 years. We added one senior person to our leadership team. Wow. We hired a senior VP of finance. So it was the chief accounting officer. And that person was with the company for about 2 years and left. Which then made the board sit up and say, well, is there something about the inclusive environment here, so that when you do have senior level people of color, they don't feel very welcome. We talked about this at our board meetings. We would have the leadership team come and present the pipeline metrics, et cetera. So there was a lot of commitment, but it didn't translate to the level of accountability that delivered results. So we can talk about this more later, but I wanted to kind of share with you an effort, a sincere effort on the part of the board that was not very productive and really did not yield good results.
Wow, there is a lot to unpack in that. But I think there's a couple of things that come to mind. One is, certainly I do think that there is something to be said for kind of understanding, before you jump into the deep end of the pool on this, understanding the organization's readiness, whether it's DE&I or any other kind of a metric. We have found, and Mike, you can certainly speak to this too, we have found that it is almost never successful to introduce a metric into an organization for the very first time in an incentive plan. I mean, you should be using measures in your incentive plan because they reinforce the way you run the company. Mm-hmm. And if you don't, and if these types of metrics Again, as I said, whether it's DE&I or any other kind of metric, if it's not kind of embedded in your day-to-day lingo, if it's not part of what you talk about in, weekly, executive leadership meetings and team meetings, if it's not important to the ethos of the company, it's not going to be effective in an incentive plan, no matter what kind of weighting you put on it. I don't know whether you want to kind of riff off that or not, Mike.
Yeah. Mike, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Word.
No, I'd certainly agree, Jan. Where we found it, and I happen to be somebody who has a client who's one of those 8% that have it as a standalone metric. But to some of the points that were raised that we need to unpack, diversity is not inclusion, right? Or equity. It is a different thing. Diversity, very quantitative. You can measure it, and they do in their incentive plan. Now, as a way of ensuring that it isn't just process, but it's longer lasting, they set their threshold for the coming year at what their actual levels were for the prior year. So it's always a continuous improvement in terms of pushing diversity, whether it's at the senior management ranks or hires or promotions. But what we got out of the process is you can define those metrics all you want, but it really has to result in a change, as Susan was describing, in where you go to source new hires and talent, and how you bring those folks along, on the promotion track or in the senior management team. And then it becomes more about the E and the I, and not so much about the D.
Right.
Well, yeah, you get this issue of, if you think about kind of the trajectory, there's giving people a seat at the table, and that's, the diversity. Do you open up chairs at the table? But then once they've got a seat at the table, do you let them talk? And when they talk, do you listen to them?
Correct.
Eileen, I know you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
I was going to add on, and I think Shelley Geyer just asked a good question, and I'd like to highlight that as board members, are we seeing this information, even just the data coming in from our comp advisors? As comp advisors, do you naturally include this in your management reports? Because typically at a comp committee meeting, both Susan and I chair comp committees, we would have the outside comp advisor come in at least twice a year and do a market update, looking at peer groups, whatever it is that we're asking them to report on. But I have not seen I use different comp advisors at two different companies. Neither one of them has come forward voluntarily and presented this information about what other companies are doing as far as in their incentive plans. So as board members, I think it's important for us to ask our comp advisors to include that as part of the standard meeting agenda. And Shelley,
well, Eileen, you just need to change your comp advisor.
I would say too, Eileen, that you were pointing out, and again, I think Jannice, the data that you showed us certainly points out to what my experience has been, which is it's got to be made. There's got to be enough accountability around this issue to do the hard work, because the hard work is opening up that aperture in terms of where you are sourcing. It is focusing, and you're right, Eileen, it's really ESG. I mean, it's really thinking about what are we doing to make it possible in our company for diverse talent to succeed and to be moved forward and to be included and to sit at the table and feel as if they can voice their opinions. And that's really the harder work. And I think what we realized was that the soft metrics that we were really using to take a look at process really didn't focus enough on the hard work. And as I said earlier, wasn't enough of the incentive comp plan to really motivate senior leadership to do the hard work, which at the end of the day delivers good results.
So I guess a question for the board members that are with us today: what is meaningful? How much do you think the short-term incentive or the longer-term incentives are harder to put into the criteria, because you're talking about restricted stock or options or performance-based stock? And as Jan pointed out, that those are very, very long-term metrics that you wouldn't see some immediate activity. But on a short term, your annual incentive plan, you know, if anybody could jump in here with us and say, what do you think? Should we have 50% of their short-term incentive tied to DEI activities, 25%? You know,
Yes, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yeah.
I mean, I'll tell you where we've seen it. It has almost, I can't think of a case where it's more than 25%. And in most cases where I've seen it, it's somewhere between 5 and 15.
Yeah, I think that's right. And to be honest, you know, it's a bit of, you know, kind of baby steps in terms of the process where it's specifically articulated in incentive plans. I think the at least focus early on has been, let's go easy on it at first and get some experience with how we're progressing before we kind of ramp up the weighting, in other words. And part of that is due to, you know, just having it as a formal metric in the incentive plan does signal, you know, the priorities of the organization. May not be as much as financial, and that's certainly still the case, as Jan mentioned, but it is important, especially if it's a bonus plan that cascades to everybody. Everybody's got a stake in it. We're all pulling oars in the same direction, and then as they gain experience, you know, ramping up the weighting on the metric.
Well, and I think, you know, the other thing I'd love to hear some thoughts on is around the actual measures themselves, because I think part of the challenge here is, you know, as somebody mentioned, you know, the diversity piece is easy. It's just a numbers game, and we all know how to count, right? But the issue is, how do you avoid the unintended consequence of, you know, whether it's on the front end around recruitment, saying, well, we're going to institute a Rooney Rule on recruitment, and there's got to be a diverse candidate in every, you know, outside position that we fill. And so, okay, management can check that box. We'll just put somebody on the list, even though we all know, wink, wink, nod, nod, we have no intention of hiring them, but we check the box. Or, you know, you recruit people to check that diversity box, but you have an engagement problem and you know, an inclusion problem, and so those positions become just a turnstile, you know. So and putting in incentive measures around the inclusion piece is really hard, because it's hard to measure.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of, I just saw a really good question that came in from Simon, which is how would we support that the board measures equity and inclusion? I mean, if we want to base some portion of an incentive compensation plan on this, then, you know, we do have to have some metrics and what would really be appropriate in that regard. I think it's really a great question.
And building on that question is, is it additive? You only have 100%, right? So
Right.
Are you taking it away from?
Exactly. I think that's the other con on this side. You know, we've talked about there are some pros for why you would want to think about putting these metrics in the plan, You know, one of the contests, it has to come from someplace. If we say, well, 5% isn't enough, to where Susan started on this conversation, and we say, well, 5% isn't enough, well, let's make it 10 or 15%. What in your incentive plan has suddenly become 10 or 15% less important? Is profit 10 or 15% less important than it was last year? I doubt it. You know, you got to take it from someplace. And I think that's the other thing that companies really struggle with. The other kind of area for discussion, and I would love to kind of hear from some quarters on the phone of folks that we haven't heard from, is, you know, we're talking about this incentive plan as kind of the only tool in the board's toolbox around signaling to the organization and to customers and the street that DE&I is important to us. Is the incentive plan really the only tool we've got available to us to send that message? And might there actually be some other tools in our toolbox that would be equally effective or maybe even more effective in sending that message?
So Sherry Barrett, may I put you on on the spot here? Because I think you just had a good chat item in there about well-defined objectives. What does that look like? Share with us your question or your ideas. We'd love to hear it.
It's more an idea than it is anything else. So one of the boards that I serve on has a diversity and inclusion modifier, I'll say, in its annual incentive program. Just put it in, and you know, great, we've done that. But I really reflect, and as I listen to you all, it really drives it home. What's way more important than that is having really well-defined objectives. And that's been the struggle, at least with one company, to get the senior managers to take on some real measurable objectives. So I feel like the incentive program, I mean, I sort of won that battle, but it's kind of empty because without the right objectives, it doesn't matter. And you really don't need the incentive plan sometimes, because what you measure, you get. And these are successful people that don't like to miss goals. So, yeah.
Sherry, I agree with you. And I think that was, Simon, I was not dodging your question. It's that was our biggest struggle. What should the objectives, what should the targets be? I mean, how do we find the right balance between not imposing artificial requirements of the leadership team? We obviously, we want them to hire the best people for the positions, but at the same time, we realize that there are women, there are people of color who have the right skill sets and credentials for these positions. But what is the right metric? Should we be saying of 5 openings in the company, we would like to see at least 2 of them or 3 of them filled by a woman or a person of color? This was the round and round that we had, and I think it's why we really never did get to any movement, right? Where we were coming up with more quantifiable metrics to gauge progress. There were always trade-offs, and I'll just say very quickly to reinforce what Jannice said. Our other challenge was how much of the STIP should tie, because then what else are we going to de-emphasize, if you will? But I can tell you that 5% was not enough.
Not enough. Rochelle, can we have you jump in here? You're seeing a lot of board recruitment activity. What are they saying around compensation elements?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're seeing just in terms of metrics that, you know, back to what Susan was just saying, is they're talking about where they are versus where they want to be. And, you know, maybe if it's that they've never had any diversity candidates come into their executive pipelines, then they're target, you know, this month or this job is 1, and the next time it's 3, and the next time it's, you know, so it's about improving where they are in some kind of incremental process relative to their industry location. You know, there are many factors in that process, One thing I've seen boards talk about, but haven't seen anything written down in terms of compensation, was really looking at the tenure and employee engagement scores. So ensuring they have the questions on the employee engagement scores to measure that inclusivity and the right information around equity. Although I did talk to one company that was very concerned. They'd done an entire equity survey because they were gonna get it right. They had a great company come in, and I think it might have been Pearl Meyer, I forget, it's been a couple of years. They got it right, and then they didn't ensure that it stayed right. And about 5 years later, as they went back to go track that equity and pay incentives, those kinds of things again, it had gotten lopsided again, and they had to, piece from that was they had to keep looking at equity and compensation and keep talking about it with all levels of business to ensure that it didn't get lopsided again.
You know, on that score, I think one of the things, you know, as we talk about metrics, you know, I think that it's, you can think about leading indicators, lagging indicators, as you think about what metrics. What I've seen be most successful is whether or not it's in an incentive plan, making sure that, you know, at either the full board level or at the relevant committee level, you're seeing some kind of dashboard reporting on a regular basis. And it's things like looking at those diversity numbers around, you know, what does our pipeline look like, and what's the demographic of the current seats at the table. But it's also things around, I think, as Rochelle said, you know, things like what does our turnover rate look like, and is our turnover rate different for women and people of color than it is for other demographic groups? Can we see any data in there that suggests that we maybe have a problem? Doing the pay equity, pay gap analysis to underscore that our pay practices are fair and equitable, and that we're not sending unintended messages by virtue of how we pay people. You know, one of the things that the pay gap analysis will highlight is around, you know, kind of, you know, do we have higher paid positions more likely occupied by men versus lower paid positions being more likely occupied by women? So you get the whole, you know, pink collar problem. So you have white collars, blue collars, and pink collars. So I mean, but I think as you're going through that process, it's important that you think about not only kind of some of those leading indicator numbers, but are there some lagging indicator numbers that we can look at that give us a hint that maybe there's an issue that we need to look at. I think engagement survey data is interesting. I think the challenge with engagement survey data is that if you're doing it on a firm-wide basis, it's hard to do those surveys more than once a year because they tend to be a pretty significant undertaking, and life can move awfully fast for once a year.
Let me add to that, because as a board members, right, there's a difference between governance and oversight versus being adjunct management, right? And I think it's, where do you draw that line? You as a board member want to be asking management to report on certain data at every board meeting. I'd like to go back to the example at Advent International. We've actually pulled together a template that they have to report on every single quarter. The template includes what is your current diversity profile by board members, senior management, general employees, broken up by ethnicity and gender. And also, they have to report every year when they do their annual pay increases. They have to do a distribution of performance ratings and pay increases, both base pay increases and the promotional and adjustment increases, not only by gender, which I think a lot of companies have been doing over the years, is doing gender, but now we've required every single company to report on ethnicity, in addition to gender, for all those. So as board members, we have a lot of power to help influence and require some accountability from our leadership team without just putting it into the annual incentive plan. Doing something every quarter is critically important. I want to call out, let's see, Joseph Lackey is with us today as the CEO of Dreams Fulfilled. I hate to put you on the spot here, Joseph, but you had a long commentary on the compensation practices of diverse talent versus non-diverse talent. And perhaps if you can frame that as how board members need to be thinking about that, that would be great for this audience.
Yes, Eileen. Basically, I think my point was you have to be careful, because if you start to selectively, weight your compensation packages towards DE&I, then the candidates that aren't in that pool might actually be slighted. So I guess the point comes back to equity pay for equity performance. But then you also have to balance that if there are laggards in the group, and I don't know what the statistics show, but if there is a trend that there are laggards, then you kind of have to look at the situation and say, well, we want to include the DE&I and get the compensation increased so that this group is happily, performing, and is getting the compensation they're deserved. And it is obviously an extreme struggle to balance those different aspects, and you don't want your best performers to walk away from the table and to go to your competitor. So that's something we've struggled with, in the automotive sector as well as in the oil and gas sectors, because we're always balancing, well, we want to fairly compensate people for their talents, but if you do weight a certain group, then if that group isn't the better performing group, then that can create problems too. So you kind of have to look at the whole situation, and if they're not the better performing group, then what can you do from a talent management standpoint to bring their skills up so that they are performing like the rest of the company? So those are some of the struggles we've seen, and obviously we try to target the pool so that we can bring their talents up if they are lacking.
You raise an interesting point that I've maybe the rest of us have heard in boardrooms or management meetings, where they say, well, we just can't find the qualified talent. People of color just aren't at these senior level jobs in order for us to draw from, or we haven't seen any qualified women to be selecting from. And that's assuming that the aperture that they're looking at is so narrow that they're not broadening out their, if you are saying in order to have a board member join you, that they have to have previous board experience, for example, well, you've just narrowed your field down, by 3/4 instead of being willing to take a new first-time board member. If you're saying your board member has to have been at the CEO or CXO level of a billion-dollar company in order for them to join. Well, once again, you have just limited your pipeline, by 3/4. So to your point, as you state, making sure that you've got your criteria correct and that you're not overweighting based on gender or ethnicity, but at the same time, making sure that you are broadening your management's view of who they should be selecting for these senior level jobs. Yeah. So kind of getting back to compensate or not to compensate. Right?
Yeah, Eileen, we have binders of women.
Yeah, exactly. Right. We've heard that term. We've got binders of women. Do we have binders of people of color as well? Right?
Binders of people of color as well.
I think that these are great points. And Joseph, I think that you're also touching on a point that we have to be careful of, which is that we don't too narrowly define what we mean by diversity. Mm-hmm. Because diversity is, there's a spectrum. There is sexual orientation, there is gender identification, there is religion. There are a lot of different elements that go into diversity. And we also have to be careful that we're not sending messages that we want to be very welcoming. If you're a woman, we want to be very welcoming. If you're a person of color, we're not thinking so much about other dimensions of diversity. So you didn't say that, and I know you didn't mean that at all, but it just reminded me when you were talking about having to be careful, that we also need to make sure that we are embracing diversity in its fullest.
The other thing I would note that falls into the category of never let a good crisis go to waste that I've heard some clients talk about is, you know, as we've seen companies kind of move to this work from home model, the fact that may actually open up some opportunities to address diversity, that the more traditional, everybody must come to the office at the corporate headquarters every day from 9 to 5 days a week, was creating some limits, geographic limits or time availability limits that have now been somewhat lifted. If we take advantage of the fact that people don't have to move to take a new job. You know, I have one of my clients who happens to be in upstate, kind of in the, in rural Minnesota, and it is very hard for them to address people of color issues in their management pool. But now that everybody's working from home anyway, and they don't require people to move, it's been easier for them to kind of address that issue. And I think that other companies may find that true as well.
There's another comment that was made on the chat, Joshua Abramson from Global Logic. I'm going to pull you in here if you're still with us about as board members, you are looking at your entire organization and your management team, and having global responsibility is very different, right? Joshua, are you with us still where you could?
I am.
Great. Let's chat a little bit about the challenge of domestic operations versus global operations and how you can hold your management team accountable in different ways.
Well, I know that for our executive leadership team and for the board, diversity is a #1 issue, and they're addressing it at the board level. But when it comes to the lens that we're measured on, diversity, equity, inclusion, with 90% of our workforce in India and Eastern Europe, for them, it has more to do about class, about bringing women into the workforce for the first time, as well as the universal issues like adding to our management ranks through gender diversity. So it's a very different lens, and one that we're always doing a balancing act.
And do you have either yourself or somebody on the management team that has to report to the board about what's happening with your DEI journey?
Again, it's very early days. So I'm responsible for our environmental, social, and governance practice. And it is a #1 board priority. And my function actually sits in finance. So we're looking at this very much from a business case point of view. And even though it's non-material, we see that it's a 1-to-1 link to materiality.
Yeah, very good point. Susan, what about kind of getting back to this conversation? Should we or should we not put incentives into the plan? And if so, a couple of the comments are, how do you put, first of all, the percentage? I think we all agree 5% wasn't enough. Is 10%, as Mike mentions, at least it's sending a signal that it's important. We're putting some level of measure, but let's say it is 25%, or I think I also heard Sherry talk about a modifier, which was the first time I thought about that. You have your standard plan, but maybe there's a modifier to add on top, almost like an accelerator to one of the metrics.
Susan,
I
what do you?
like that idea, Sherry. My ears perked up also. I thought that was really a great idea because, you know, DE&I, ESG really should be something that wraps around most of what we do. It really should be built into the business model. And that this notion of having an accelerator, Eileen, or a modifier, is really a great idea because it doesn't take it and sit it off to a side. It really means that it can modify how we have defined success in other areas. So I think that's really a great idea. I personally feel, again, just because I've sort of struggled with this as a comp chair, that the only way that you really can create accountability is by having metrics and building it into comp, as we say. If it's not getting measured, it's not getting done for the most part. So the percentage is a challenge because the more you put into this, the more you are de-emphasizing other things. So I'm very intrigued by this idea of some kind of modifier, or, as you said, Eileen, an accelerator. I think that's a very clever idea. Maybe our colleagues at Perlmutter can try this out somewhere and let us know how well it works. There was one other quick point I wanted to make, and I don't want to take us away from this notion of sort of building it to incent financially or not. But I wanted to say very quickly that one of the things that I think that we bring into the company, we bring into the boardroom as we increase the diversity. So I am now one of several women on most of my boards, but I'm still most often the only African-American that's sitting on the board. And what I bring in addition to perspectives, I also bring a network. I bring a network of talent that can be tapped into. And again, you have to be careful, of course, not to overstep and get into any role in managing the company, but often just even as a resource on the board, where else could we look to recruit? You know, do we have relationships? Sometimes I think that there's a role that we as board members can play, those of us who are women, those of us who are people of color on boards, that can influence the process in different ways. So I wanted to say that quickly, but Eileen, I want to go back to your point, because I'd love to hear what other people are thinking about that. That's a key topic. To incent or not to incent, or to build into incentive comp or not.
Well, I might be biased here. I'll jump in a little bit, but I would say, you know, the focus on DE&I, I mean, while it's been ramped up, you know, this past year, if we think about some of its origins, you can almost think at the board level. And the requirement, rightly or wrongly, to have 2 women on the board of California, you know, organizations, I think that drove a lot of movement early on, at least to get the proverbial ball started rolling downhill. So I'm for putting it into an incentive plan just as a way to break the inertia. Let's figure out how we best measure it and how we improve on it, and then move toward longer term metrics associated with the E and the I. And those might wind up in a long-term plan at some point.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Mike, that, you know, you, in some ways, when you think about the metrics that you use for incentive plans, some of them are kind of constants. They are how you measure success of the business, particularly financial success of the business. But sometimes you use measures for remedial purposes, or to focus the attention of an organization for a relatively short period of time in the organization's life, to say, you know, this isn't something that we'll measure forever, but it's something that we're going to measure right now just to make the point, right? And, with any luck, DE&I is particularly the D side of DE&I is one of those things where you would hope that over the course of time, we'd stop putting it in the incentive plan because we didn't need it anymore.
Can I call out Rich Horan? Rich, you made a good comment here about trying to oversimplify the issue. Can you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when it comes to this topic, we tend to try to break it down into allocations, right? And we tend to live in tribes. We have a tribe of, Blacks and Hispanics and LGBT, and we just want our number. And it's way more complex than that. And so the question is, how do we get beyond those individual superficial diversity issues and get to that? And then it's somewhat of a third rail. And no one intended this, but Joseph made a comment of, hey, if I have some underperformers, but I have people getting rated based on what their scores are, but so do I inflate their grades. And then the first thing that happens is, then we talk about all the groups that had biases against them. And so it's kind of a third rail topic often. And so we often don't talk about it. We're afraid to say the wrong thing because then people are going to come down on us. So I think I don't know what the answer is other than in my world, I did live in what I'll call some bias, but it was based on uniform color, right? So I was Air Force and we all lived and died together. We trusted each other. And, at times we did have some people of color, some folks who were non-typical, white males in the Air Force. And I had a hard time keeping a lot of them because they were very, very a rare commodity that was often recruited. There was a time when airlines were hiring no one but minorities. And I had 3 of my best fighter pilots that got recruited because they went, hey, sir, I love the Air Force, love what I'm doing, but I got United beating the door down to get me to come in and be an airline pilot. So, sometimes we have to look at, there are positive things that are happening out there. So
as a board member, how do you
fix it?
Yeah.
I wish I knew, because then I could put Pearl Meyer out of business.
Is it
I think
something that gets
actually,
there
I do have, I'm sorry.
compensation?
No, actually, I think it really starts, it's a culture issue.
Yeah.
How do you change culture? You change culture with incentive. Because the other thing I'm going to say is pay is one of the worst areas. It has some of the most unintended consequences.
Yes.
Some of the most, some of the worst things we've read about in the press come from misaligned incentives, right? You look at Wells Fargo, hey, get more applications. So people are notoriously good at giving you what you ask for, not necessarily what you want. And I really think it's and again, I think it comes back to Jannice's earlier comment. Is this the right way to change it? Maybe at the very top. And as with leadership, who's in the boardroom? Yeah. Who is it that the board has hired as a CEO? And and if it's not important to the CEO, I don't care what incentives are. It's really not going to change the culture of your organization. That's my 2 cents. That's what kind of what my thought was.
That was actually more than 2 cents. I'll give you a quarter on that one.
I agree.
Rochelle, I had a question for you. You've been seeing over the years board composition changing, and whether it's gender representation or ethnic representation. Have you seen any correlation between the representation and then the performance of the company or the DEI journey of that particular company because it's got better representation at the board?
So I want to say 2 things that are maybe unpopular, but there's research, so I'll just say that first. I think it's too early to tell is the short answer to what you're asking. In Norway, about 12, 14 years ago, they immediately mandated women on boards. It was just about women, not other diversity factors. They got the women that they wanted right away. And 10 years later, there were real issues with women still feeling like a quota, not having real value and feeling like there's not enough value in what they're saying. And the biggest issue, which I think is what we should all be thinking about, is it didn't backfill the senior level middle management for women. So, and that was 10 years later. What ended up happening is those women left those roles, went right into the board roles, and there was nobody there to say, keep bringing the women up through the roles. So I just mentioned that, and I can share the article on that, on the research on that. It's really interesting. So boards, I think in the US, now that was a quota, not a goal.
Right,
And when boards in the US are talking more about this, going back to like to incent or not to incent, there's a lot of conversation around what gets measured gets done, no matter what the issue is. If it's about selling widgets, or back to what Rich was just saying about Wells Fargo. So I think that if we're going to, as boards are starting to diversify, and it's happening a little slowly, more slowly than things like Norway, there's a lot more conversation happening, but it tends to almost always take 2 to 3 voices in that room to ensure that those initiatives at the executive level and through the company are uplifted. And that's why I think some of what's going on in California, especially around a tier expectation and multifaceted diversity components, is a really interesting conversation for a long-term dialogue around how this is going to actually help really everyone across industry, across company type and size, diversify their ranks and grow their businesses.
Can I have Becky Taylor ask the last question, because Daniela targeted me and said she wants a minute at the end of the session. So Becky, you had a very good comment about 3 metrics. Can I put you on the spot to talk about that?
Oh, sure. Thank you, Eileen. So this is a quote from a mentor of mine who was a senior officer of Digital Equipment Corporation, which was the second largest computer company in the world in the 90s, and then they slowly disappeared. But they were extremely well managed and well led in their heyday. And he told me once that you should always aim to use metrics with a small number of metrics possible. And he used the number 3. And in his experience, he found that if you had more than 3 major metrics that you were using to try and drive your executive management team in a certain direction, the metrics would combine in ways that often produced exactly the opposite behavior from what you were wanting. So I'm very curious how to incorporate DEI initiatives and goals, trying to follow that great advice, which I have followed pretty faithfully for the last 20 years when trying to incentivize leadership teams.
Yeah, I think one of the things for me, one of the great ideas that came up for me today was a modifier or an accelerator on top of whatever your core, in most of my companies, we only have 2 objectives, revenue and EBITDA, or revenue and, TSR for long-term incentives, what have you. You're right. It's usually not a lot of more than 3 metrics for the executive team, but I love the idea of an accelerator on top of one of those metrics. If you do something else on your DEI journey. That was one of the ideas I'm going to take away today. How about you, Susan? Anything?
Absolutely. And I was just responding to Habib, who was making the point about the importance of the financial case, the financial metrics. And I was just saying to him, there's a growing portfolio of data which demonstrates the economic value that's delivered by diversity. So rather than typing it out, I'll just throw it out right now. But that is one of my key takeaways from today. I really do want to think more about this accelerator. That is just a great, great suggestion.